Months before the new decade even rolled around, I had started a box to put in the decks that I thought no longer felt like they served a purpose in my collection. So these were the decks that I had received but never connected with, the decks that I'd purchased but never really got around to using, and also the decks that I did connect with for a short time but no longer felt like they had a place in my collection, or maybe I just kind of moved on from them. So here we are, already into the second month of a new decade, and here my box still sits. These decks have just been in this box for months. So why am I having such a hard time getting rid of it? Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I thought we'd just have a little chat about the struggle I've been having with trying to cull my collection, because let me tell you, the struggle has been real. It's not really the decks that I didn't connect with that I'm having a hard time getting rid of. It's those decks that I do have a connection with, or I did have a connection with at one point, that I'm struggling with trying to decide whether or not to keep them. And I have asked myself, like, why get rid of them at all? So why do I feel this need to cull my collection in the first place? So let's chat about that for a minute, because maybe that might shine some light on this for me. So on a practical level, I have over 200 decks. Trying to find space to house those 200 decks is actually a challenge. So that being said, I'm kind of limited to my shelf space that I have, and I can only fit so many decks on my shelves. And that's just kind of a practical consideration, is that how much room do I actually have to store decks? So that's definitely been something that I've been struggling with lately, because if I store them in a place where I can't see them, then I'm not going to use them. That's probably a whole nother thing there. So on an emotional level, another reason why I'm thinking about, or have been thinking about, or have been trying for the last few months to cull my collection, is that on an emotional level, I'm starting to feel a little bit overwhelmed and suffocated by the amount of decks that I have. Now, I adore all of my decks. Like, in some way, shape, or form, there is something about all of my decks that I adore. It's why there's a reason I bought them in the first place, right? But having that sheer number of decks means that I have to try and decide, like, every week when I sit down to figure out what decks, or every month when I sit down to figure out what decks I'm going to use at this time, I have to go through those decks, and it's just a lot. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by them. It's a lot of choices, I guess, and maybe it's just too many choices for me. So anyway, so point being that on a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, but I'm just calling it an emotional level for lack of a better term, I'm feeling just a little bit overwhelmed and suffocated by all of them. So like, that all sounded good and made sense in my head, right? I wrote down all these reasons and I was like, yes, this totally makes sense. I can rationalize each of these reasons why I need to cull my collection, why it's gotten away from me. When it came down to the time to actually go through my decks and decide which decks I was going to keep and which decks that I was going to pass on, there was like no rationality to it. And like I said, it really, the ones that I didn't ever connect with, that was like no problem. Toss those in a box and we're good to go, right? I'm totally good with moving those on because I don't have a personal connection to those decks. What the problem came down to was the decks that I did have a connection to, or that I felt something about. And it really became an emotional issue. And it's an emotional attachment is really what it is. So let's talk about what I've done so far to try and kind of cull my collection. And you'll probably get a kick out of it because it's been a bit ridiculous what I've actually done. So the first thing that I actually did, or one of the first things that I did, was to go through my collection and find decks that had like a similar style, a similar vibe, maybe a similar purpose in my collection. And that was helpful, and I was able to weed out some decks that I thought, like, this is just really repetitive energy for me and I don't need two of them. So that was, again, a little step towards culling my collection, because I was able to pull out a couple of decks using that criteria. The next thing that I tried to do was to add in more boxes. So I had 3 boxes at one point in my office. I had a box for decks that I definitely wanted to keep, decks that I definitely wanted to get rid of, and decks that I was still on the fence about. And the really great thing about that was it really solidified the decks I definitely want to get rid of, and it pretty well solidified the decks that I wanted to keep. But those decks that I was like needed to reconsider, they just sat in the box and I didn't do anything with them until eventually I just said, this is ridiculous, and pulled all of them out of the other 2 boxes and just left the box of decks that I knew I wanted to get rid of. Another thing I tried is that Marie, I don't know, whatever it is, the like asking each deck, does it bring me joy? Or asking myself, each deck, does it bring me joy? And I think that that's a great idea, but the problem for me is when it comes to decks, I can find something about any deck that'll bring me joy. Like even decks that I don't particularly connect with or decks that I don't really like, there is something about them that can bring me joy or does bring me joy, because otherwise, why did I buy them in the first place, right? There had to be something that enticed me to buy it in the first place. And therefore that method really didn't do any good for me, because I was like, oh, this brings me joy because of this, and this brings me joy because of this, and my whole this brings me joy pile was on my decks. So I'm not sure that that was a really great option for me. The next thing that I kind of tried was assigning my decks into a couple of different categories. I had a category for decks that I wanted to work with this year, decks that I wanted to work with later on, and then of course decks I wanted to get rid of. Like the decks in the box of decks that are going to leave my collection, like those just kind of hang out. They've been hanging out in my office like for months now. So I tried taking the rest of the decks and kind of dividing them up into 2 different piles. Again with the pile thing. Anyway, what was I saying? This is why I don't do videos like this. Anyway, I had my 2 piles, okay? So I had a pile for decks that I wanted to work with this year. So I was like, oh, I like all these decks, or I haven't worked with them yet, so I'm gonna work with these ones. And then the rest of them, I was like, I'll just put in a box, I'll put in the closet, and then I'll, go back through them maybe in 6 months, maybe in a year, whatever it was. Great idea, right? For me, not so much, because the minute those decks were in the closet and in the box and out of my reach, I was like, oh, the deck I want is whatever deck that's in the box that I can't have right now, because I've told myself, you can't have these ones, you have to work with these ones. So yeah, that's a thing. So anyway, I eventually got those decks back out of the closet because I'm like, this just is not working, because then I kept having to dig through my closet to get to the decks, because I have, like as I said, half of my closet is like computer equipment and the other half is my crafting supplies. So finding room to store the rest of my decks was quite the challenge. And then I had to dig through boxes to try and pull things out of the closet to try and get to them. It was just a mess. It was a disaster. So then I tried actually sitting down and asking my decks, who wants to stay, who wants to go. So I shuffled my decks and I went through pretty much all of them except for the ones that I 100% knew they were going, or I 100% knew they were staying. It was mostly the decks that I was in question about. And so I sat down throughout the course of several weeks and I would shuffle each deck and I would ask it, do you want to stay or are you ready to go? And then I would draw a card. The problem with that is that a lot of times I was like, I'm not really sure what this means. Which is funny because I read cards, that's what I do, right? I can lay down a spread and look at it and go, that's what that means to me. Trying to ask my cards whether they want to go or stay, I couldn't make heads or tails of the card pulls for the most part. There were a few that bam, throw down a major arcana and I know exactly what you're trying to tell me. But some of them, I'd get some of the minors and it's I don't know. Maybe I want to go, maybe I want to stay. So totally unhelpful, but it was fun. So another thing that I did is I went through my decks, because I do thankfully have a spreadsheet of all of my decks. And so I just went through my spreadsheet and I thought about each deck and thought, why do I have this deck? What purpose does it serve in my collection? Am I even still using it? And that was really insightful, but again, didn't really help me weed out anything, because even if I had a deck that I couldn't 100% pinpoint its purpose in my collection or why I bought it, it would be but I really like the artwork. It's pretty, I like it, I want to keep it. I couldn't tell you why. I don't really have a point or a purpose for it, but I like it and I want to keep it. So I do want to say that this is all just for me personally, right? Everybody's experience with culling their collection is going to be different. So I just want to make sure I'm just telling you my personal experience with it and the struggles that I have had along the way, because it's been a thing for a while now. So what I've noticed is that going through my journals and whatnot, I am definitely a person that kind of tunes into seasonal energy. And the decks that I use kind of tend to fall into those seasonal categories. And this is something that I did last year. And, you know, I divided all my decks up into one of the 4 seasons. And that was great, except for, again, I had that same problem of I boxed them up and I put them away. And that, I think, is where I went wrong with the seasonal thing. Because while I like having my decks organized by season, because that's how I naturally tend to gravitate towards them anyway. And so I do have this kind of seasonal undertone to how I work with my decks. So I thought, well, I need to tap into that, because that's already kind of a structure or category that's already a natural part of my practice. Maybe that's where I'm getting at with this whole ramble. But as I've done this before and it didn't work for me before, I think where I went wrong was that I actually put the other decks away. So if it was spring, I only had out my spring decks and I put all the other ones away. Once it's put away, then inevitably there will be a deck somewhere in there that I want to work with for a particular reason or a particular reading or something like that. And then I have to go drag them all back out again. And then I'm just irritated at myself because that's so much work. Why did I do that to myself? So where I've done differently this time around is that my decks are now divided by season for the most part, but they are on my shelves in baskets so I can get to them at any time. That keeps them kind of grouped together by their energy, by their kind of seasonal association. And by season association, I mean my personal seasonal association for each deck. It just like I pick up a deck and this feels winter to me, or this feels fall, that kind of thing. Doesn't necessarily mean it is. Again, this is all just total emotional connection. So each time I did go through one of these processes, I did actually, I pulled a few more decks out, and a few more decks went into the box of decks that I'm going to pass on. But as you can imagine, like this has been a really long, drawn out process. And the longer it went on, kind of the more stressful it was. So what was kind of started out to be like a fun, I'm going to go through and cull my collection, I turned it into this massive, several month long exercise in frustration and procrastination. Because what I discovered was that the more times or the more ways that I came up with to try and cull my collection, the longer it actually took me to get rid of things. So I could put things in a box and then it was like, I'm not going to use it anymore. It's over here. That's cool. And I don't want to get into it. I don't pull them back out, but it's like they're here, right? I still have them. They're still in my office. I'm just not using them. And for the most part, if they're in the box, I don't have any desire to use them. I've either not connected with them or I've already moved on, but I'm still not letting them go. They're still sitting here. And part of the thing that makes this, I think, kind of funny to me is that I am like notoriously known for being unsentimental about things. So like with family and friends, people are like, don't give it to Dawn, she'll get rid of it. Because I don't keep things like in my house. I don't keep things that don't serve a purpose. It's probably a good thing my kids, they serve a purpose, I guess. Anyway, I'm really notoriously known for that, like in real life. I'm always donating things. I'm like, we haven't used this in 6 months, it's going. I don't keep things in my house. So that's just my personality. It's like, if it doesn't have a purpose and we don't need it, it's out of here. I want it clean. I want to make room for something else, or I just want the open space. So the fact that I'm having such an issue with my decks is actually kind of funny because I am so not that way in general. So I keep asking myself, like, why are my decks different? Why is this so different? Because I could go through my house like right now and I could clean things out and I could get rid of things and it would be no problem. Yesterday, for example, I went through my bookshelf And I love books. Like, I seriously love my books. But at any rate, getting rid of my books, no problem. Getting rid of my decks, why am I having such a problem with this? And the more that I thought about it, I think the problem is that to me, my decks really aren't just paper and ink, right? They have kind of like this energy of their own. They're like, I totally personify my decks. I will totally admit that, right or wrong, I do personify my decks because all of them feel like they have an energy to me. Wouldn't necessarily call it a personality, although I think some decks definitely have a personality. But overall, decks to me feel like they have an energy. And seeing as I use my decks in a very personal way, they have become like my council of advisors, my soul guides. They are kind of the voice of my soul. And so every time I put one in a box, it kind of, like one of those decks, it kind of felt like I was putting a piece of myself in the box. Like, even if I haven't touched the deck in a year, I'm like still feeling like, how can I get rid of that deck? How can I do that? So that's what I've kind of come around to through this whole several month. I mean, we could be talking 6 months here. I mean, it's been a long time. Through this whole process, really what I've kind of come to terms with is that that's my criteria. So everything goes in the box. And if when I put a deck in the box, I feel like a piece of me just went with it, then I rescue it. And that's kind of my criteria on whether or not I'm going to keep a deck or not, is if it feels like giving it away is giving away a piece of me or an important piece of my practice, then I'm not going to give it away. So a lot of times we talk about the really practical side of culling our collection, of getting rid of decks we don't use or getting rid of decks that, didn't work for us or whatever. But I really wanted to take a minute and talk about the emotional connection and the sort of internal struggle that I experienced trying to cull my collection. Maybe it's just me, maybe I am too emotionally attached to my decks, or I would say that, maybe I'm just the type of person that has a problem with letting go of things. But judging by my, last 40 plus years, that's not the case for me. I've always been one to just out it goes. If it doesn't work, if I don't eat it, it's gone. So it's been an interesting experience for me. And I would love to know if anybody else has had, similar experiences, or if you have culled your collection or you've gone through your decks, what was your experience? And more importantly, what was the emotion going on during that? Was it an emotional experience for you? Or was it just something that was just like sorting through, column A, column B? So I would love to know, either, share with me in the comments below. I would love to know what your experience has been with trying to kind of clear out your collection. So now, are you totally wondering what's in the box? Let's take a quick peek. Okay, so let's just real quick play what was in the box. I'm not going to go into any great detail. I'm just going to show you what was in there. So this is the illustrated Herbiary, and I do have all the cards in the back. They are still completely intact. Next is the Animal Totem Tarot. This is a deck that I bought for a specific event and just didn't end up using it. So while the cards are open, everything is still intact and in order, and it's never been used. It does still have the box. Next I have two little decks here, the Gypsy Witch fortune-telling playing cards and the Seeker's Lenormand. Both of these are only in here because these are duplicates. So I already had them, they were gifted to me, and so I'm passing them along. The next deck is the Silver Era Tarot. This is one that I do really like, but when it came down to it, the characters in this deck, or the people in this deck, were just a bit on the young side for me, so it didn't really connect. The next deck that I have, and I don't have the box for anymore, but this is the Voice of the Trees. They're like Ogham cards, basically, so there's Oghams on them all. And it's a great little deck. I thought maybe I might learn some Oghams at some point. Changed my mind on that. So here's the deck. It comes in a little bag, and I do have the book for it. So next is the Mary Layton Oracle, which is, I believe, it's an indie deck. I think I got it off Etsy. And has gorgeous little artwork to it, but I have a lot of decks that have similar art styles, so I decided to go ahead and pass this one on. And I'm trying to do this quickly because this video is already super long. This is the Brian Froud's Faeries Oracle. I do like this deck. It's just, I don't know. There was something about it that just didn't really 100% connect to me. I like the artwork, but I think I like my tree Oracle type decks better. I do not have the box for this, but I do have a bag, and of course I have the book. So up next is a little like numerology set. This book is fabulous. I did read it, although I didn't put anything in it, so there's no notations, and it comes with a little deck of cards, which is really great if you're interested in learning more about numerology and using some cards with it. Another deck that I have here is the Self-Reflection deck. I think this is the first one. This to me it's a gorgeous deck. It's a beautiful example of digital art. Like, I think that this is digital art done beautifully. However, I've had this deck forever and I just don't read with it. It's got beautiful backs. It didn't come in a box or anything, so I just have it in this little white pouch, but it's a beautiful deck, but I just don't use it, so I'm going to pass it on. Next is the Goddess Power cards, and this is one I found like on Amazon, I think. And it has some nice little kind of vintagey scrapbook look feel to it, which I do kind of like, but it's essentially a goddess deck, and I have a lot of those. So this one is going to move along. Next is the Angels of Light, and I'll just show you the back that has some of the cards on it. And this is a beautiful deck. It's just one that was just a little bit busy and chaotic for me, but I really do think it has really pretty artwork. Next is the Queen of the Moon Oracle, and this is a deck. There's cards on the back here. If I pull it in, you can see it. The lighting is really bad here today. It means that it's super dark and cloudy and rainy. Anyway, this is just a digital collage type deck, and it just really kind of, it didn't do much for me. So it's a great little oracle deck. It's just not one for me. Up next is the Way Home Tarot, and this is a deck that I'm going to open this one. It has two different art styles in it because it's done by two different artists. So maybe if I can just pull half here, and we have this kind of more simplistic or minimalistic geometric style cards with these really vibrant, full-blown art style cards. And to me, a deck with either this style or this style would have been great. And I probably, had there been two decks, one of each, I probably would have bought both. But putting them together in one deck just really didn't work for me. And I really don't like the court cards. So, but that's just me personally, because I know a lot of people love that deck. So that's the Way Home Tarot. This is the Elemental Tarot. And this is one that I bought because I really liked the kind of comic book style artwork, but I have a lot of decks that have this artwork in it. So this one I'm going to go ahead and pass on. Let's see, next is Crystals, the Stone deck, and this is the one that has the little messages on the back and the crystal on the front. And I do think it's a really cool deck, and the messages on the back are really cool, but it's one that I really just didn't end up using. I did get this like an as is, so it does not have a book. All the cards are there, but I don't know if this deck even came with a book, but it's not in there if it did, because this was the last one they had. Next is the Saints and Angels Doreen Virtue, and I do also have the Life Purpose Oracle cards. This one is not even open, so I'm not going to go ahead and open it, but two Doreen Virtue decks that I thought might be interesting, didn't end up using them. This one is the Soulful Wisdom cards. This is cards for women who do too much, which is kind of funny. But anyway, this one just has these big cards that have like an affirmation on one side, and then they have like a little message on the back. So they're pretty interesting, but again, I have a lot of affirmation type decks, and I'm trying to curtail my oracles. Speaking of curtailing my oracles, we have the Conscious Spirit Oracle deck. And this is again another one that I have similar, so I've decided to move this one along. This one is the Ancient Italian Tarot. I will say this is a trimmed version, so I've trimmed it down to a square. I haven't rounded the corners and kept it square to match the backs. I've not edged it or anything. It's just been trimmed. And this one I'm just moving on because I have a lot of... I have some other Marseille decks that I just prefer. This one is the Slow Tarot, and this is a deck that has gorgeous artwork, but they're just some of the cards that really kind of bothered me, so I just really wasn't able to work with it. But it has gorgeous artwork in it, and I know everybody's seen it. I do actually have a walkthrough, I think, of this one on my channel. This is another one that I don't have the box for anymore, and it has been trimmed, and this is the Tarot of a Magical Forest. So this has been trimmed, and I have edged it in green, and you know, it's a cute deck, but I'm not real big into animal decks, so having, you know, it's just not one that gets used in my collection. So I'd rather pass it on to somebody who would appreciate it. So I'll be putting up all of these decks for sale or trade. So if you saw something here that caught your attention, just go ahead and shoot me an email. My email address is in the description box below, and we can chat about it. I hope you enjoyed this really rambly chat about my struggle with trying to cull my collection. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.